watching Big Brain Energy.
Kia ora koutou, welcome back to part 2 of a video series where we go through an in-depth explanation of the NCEA Level 3 External for Market Equilibrium. In part 1, we looked at question 1 of the exam for 2025, which is all about tax and elasticity. So if you haven't checked out the video already, you might want to check it out because we also give an introduction to the paper and the exam as a whole. So in this video, we crack straight into question 2. Question 2 is all about tariffs. So it says that although New Zealand generally aims for free and open trade environment with relatively low tariffs, some goods like textiles and clothing continue to be subject to tariffs to protect domestic industries. You might have heard a wee bit in the news currently about tariffs. They seem to be a bit of a hot topic at the moment because of a sit-in someone in the US. So this is a great opportunity to learn a little bit about how tariffs actually operate according to economic theory. If you don't know anything about tariffs, check out our video where we have covered in depth everything you need to know about tariffs for this external, link down below. Okay, so in this question, it's saying that there is a tariff getting placed on textiles and clothing in New Zealand. So the first question is, on graph 3 above, show the effect of imposing a tariff on the market for textiles and clothing by indicating with dotted lines the new quantity demanded, and we will label that with QD, and the quantity supplied, which we will label with QS. We then need to shade the new consumer surplus, new producer surplus, tariff revenue, and deadweight loss, and then make sure to label all changes. So if you're not familiar with the tariff graph, here's what it looks like. We need to draw in a horizontal line which is parallel to the PW line, which stands for P world, and it is above it. So we label this SW plus tariff and PT for the price that is traded under the tariff. So what's actually happening here with the tariff is that we're looking at the market for textiles and clothing. So we're saying that we import some clothes from overseas, like say when you buy a t-shirt online from a shop in Australia, for example, that's importing some clothing. What's happening is that a tariff has been imposed on this market, so that means that the price you pay is going to increase a little bit, and that little bit extra that you have to pay goes to the government, to the New Zealand government. It's basically like a tax which just gets paid on imported goods. So if there's a higher price, then people don't want to buy as much. So therefore, quantity demanded would decrease from Q2 to QD. So we draw a dotted line down here from where the tariff curve intersects the demand curve, and that gives us the quantity that people want to buy, the quantity demanded when there is a tariff. And then you do the same thing on the other side where the tariff curve intercepts the supply curve. So you draw a dotted line down, and that gives us QS for quantity supplied. So this is the quantity that New Zealand domestic producers of textile and clothing want to supply. So that's people who are in New Zealand selling clothes made in New Zealand, and that gives you the quantity that they want to supply in New Zealand. So we're not looking at the whole market, which includes clothes companies overseas, but just the clothes companies in New Zealand. Basically, if there is a tariff imposed, that increases the price that you have to pay if you buy clothes from overseas. But also, it means that clothes companies in New Zealand get to also raise their prices. Because basically, they are competing with companies from overseas. They can increase their price as well, because all the other clothes shops are doing it as well, effectively. Clothes from overseas cost more, so New Zealand producers may as well also increase their price. Because businesses want to take advantage of the fact that other places have raised their prices too, so they may as well do the same and get more money. So if they get more money from it, then they'd want to sell more because it is more profitable. So therefore, quantity supplied would increase. So it's increasing here from Q1 to QS. So now you can see that people want more than there is available. QD is more than QS. So if people want more than there is available in New Zealand, then they're going to buy it from overseas. So the distance between QD and QS is going to be the quantity that gets imported under the tariff. So remember, imports means the things you buy from overseas, and QS is how much New Zealand producers of clothes want to supply. So if people want to buy more clothes than there are available in New Zealand, then they're just going to import some. They're just going to buy some from overseas. The quantity that is imported under the tariff is less than what it was without the tariff. So without the tariff, the quantity imported would have been the distance between Q1 and Q2. So that's quite a big amount compared to what it is now. This is because it was cheaper without a tariff, so people would want to import more. But now it's more expensive to buy clothes from overseas because of the tariff, so therefore people import less. Alright, so let's shade and label the changes now into surpluses. Consumer surplus is the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay. It's how much consumers benefit when they buy stuff. So it's going to be from the demand curve, which is the amount that they're willing to pay, down to the price that they actually pay, which is PT under the tariff. And then it goes all the way out to the quantity that they are buying, and they're buying QD. So this whole big triangle here is going to be the consumer surplus under the tariff. The producer surplus is the difference between what producers are willing to sell for and actually sell for. So it goes from what producers are willing to sell for, which is the supply curve, and all the way up to the price that they actually receive, which is PT. So remember, when we say producers here, we're talking about the producers in New Zealand. Nothing on this graph actually talks about overseas people. Everything relates back to New Zealanders. So New Zealand producers of textiles and clothing are going to charge a higher price for their clothes, PT, because everyone else was doing it, remember, so they may as well. So they increase their price from what it was before, which was PW. So they receive a higher price, and they also sell more, QS increases. So therefore this area here is going to be the producer surplus. Tariff revenue is this box here. So this tells us the quantity that was imported under the tariff and the amount of the tariff, the dollar value. So that is the distance between PW and PT. So therefore it ends up being this box here. This is the amount that the New Zealand government receives when the tariff is implemented. If you add up all the textiles and clothes that people buy from overseas, the imports, and the tax that they pay on those, then that's going to be this box here, the tariff revenue. And then the deadweight loss is going to be these triangles here. Deadweight loss is something that was originally part of a surplus, but now it's not. So it's potential that could have been gained, but isn't. Before the tariff was imposed, consumer surplus would have gone all the way down to PW instead of PT, because that was the price that consumers actually paid. So consumer surplus has decreased from what it was before, so that leaves us with some deadweight loss, because it's not being gained by the producers and it's not being gained by the government tax revenue. So it is not being gained by anyone, so therefore it is deadweight loss. Alright, so that was everything for question A. Let's have a look now at question B. So question B says refer to graph 3, which is the graph that we just drew, and the resource material. So that means you need to mention something that was in that box there. And then the changes that you made in A on page 6 in your answer to B below. Explain the impact of the tariff on the market for textiles and clothing on consumers, producers, the government, and on allocated efficiency. This is a very typical question that they ask in this exam. We have to explain the impact on these four parties. So it would be worthwhile memorizing a model answer to each of these situations for each of the graphs that they could give you. You'll see that in question 3 in our next video that we upload, they also ask about these four parties. So it's worthwhile knowing what to write here. So if we look at consumers first, consumers have to pay the tariff. So they don't like them. They don't like the tariffs. The price that they have to pay would increase from PW to PT. So we can see that consumers are worse off when there is a tariff imposed because they need to pay a higher price for textiles and clothing. If they are paying a higher price, then they would want to decrease the quantity that they demand, which is what we showed on the graph before. Everything you say in this exam, if you can link it back to the graph, then you should. So in this case, we say that price increases from PW to PT and quantity demanded decreases from Q2 to QD. Now, to get excellence, there is a sentence that you need to include using the wording that they like. You say that the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay decreases, and there are fewer units from which to gain a surplus. What that means is the first part is saying that price increases. So therefore the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay, which is the definition of consumer surplus, remember, decreases because they have to pay more. And then you say that there are fewer units from which to gain a surplus, which means that they're buying less. Quantity demanded is decreasing, they're buying less, so therefore there are less opportunities to benefit. If you buy less stuff, then you don't have as many opportunities to benefit from it. And then let's add in a concluding sentence. We can say that hence consumer surplus decreases by the crosshatch shaded area on the graph. And that's everything that you'd need to say to get excellence for consumers. What about producers? It also says including any difference in impact on New Zealand producers of textiles and clothing and importers. So it's distinguishing here between two different types of producers. Producers who make their own clothes in New Zealand, and then producers in New Zealand who import clothes from overseas. So let's think about some boutique possum fur clothing shop. They might produce their own clothes in New Zealand, and then think about something else, like Glassons, who would import the clothes from overseas. So for the first instance, for producers who make clothes in New Zealand, some boutique possum fur clothes shop, they are better off because they will receive a higher price for selling their clothes. They increase their price from PW to PT. So therefore, they also sell a higher quantity because it's more profitable, so they want to sell more. So on the graph, quantity supplied is increasing from Q1 to QS. And then let's also say a sentence for excellence. The difference between what producers are willing to receive and actually receive increases, and there are more units from which to gain a surplus. So here you'll see that the sentence is the opposite of the consumer surplus because producer surplus is actually increasing in this case. So we're saying that the difference between what producers are willing to receive and what they actually receive increases. So that means that they're receiving a higher price. So therefore producer surplus is increasing. And there are more units from which to gain a surplus. So that means that the quantity that they're selling is increasing. So there are more opportunities for them to benefit. Hence, producer surplus increases to the vertically lined area on the graph. And then what about for New Zealand producers who import, something like Glassons? New Zealand producers of textiles and clothing benefit more from the tariff than importers of textiles and clothing. This is because when there is a tariff, imports decrease from Q2 to Q1 and QD to QS, as the tariff makes it more expensive to import textiles and clothing, whereas New Zealand producers can charge a higher price without needing to pay the tariff. So imports decrease under the tariff, and that's what we had on the graph. So therefore, if people are buying less stuff from overseas, then the producers who are doing that importing are benefiting less because there is less being brought. So therefore, New Zealand producers who make their own clothes would be better off when there is a tariff imposed than New Zealand importers. Great, and then let's look now at the government. So the government likes a tariff. This is the New Zealand government. Remember, everything on this graph links back to New Zealand. The government likes a tariff because they receive the tariff revenue. If they charge a tax on everything that you buy from overseas, then the government gets that tax, so they like that. So we can say that the government is better off because they receive a tax revenue, which is this horizontal line shaded area on the graph, which they can spend on other sectors of the economy, such as education and healthcare. In this exam, whenever you say that they can spend money on other sectors of the economy, include a couple of examples. I don't know why, but in the marking schedule, they'd like you to do that. So have a few ideas in mind for what the government could spend money on. Something like education or healthcare or infrastructure, benefits, anything along those lines. So this one's actually interesting to think about. In real life, when the government imposes a tariff, consumers are worse off, but the government is better off. So consumers have to pay more money, and then the government collects the money. So tariff benefits governments and not consumers, ignoring the impact on producers for now. So if you think about what's happening recently when the US has been imposing a bunch of tariffs on other countries, that's really good for the US government because they receive that tax revenue. And it's also good for US producers because they benefit a lot. Americans aren't going to buy stuff from overseas, they're going to start buying more stuff from the US because they don't have to pay that tariff. So that was partly why those tariffs were imposed, although arguably the reasoning got a little bit muffled and the implementation a little bit out of hand. Alright, and then lastly, let's look at allocative efficiency. So before the tariff is imposed, the market is allocatively efficient because the consumer and producer surpluses are maximised and there is no deadweight loss. This is the graph for the market without a tariff. So without the tariff, you can see that the consumer surplus goes all the way down to P world, and then the producer surplus is that little triangle at the bottom. Surpluses are maximised, they're as big as they possibly could be because there is no deadweight loss. So that means that the market is allocatively efficient. When the tariff is imposed, though, consumer surplus decreases and producer surplus increases, and the government earns a tax revenue. But that increase in producer surplus and the government's tax revenue is not actually enough to outweigh the decrease in consumer surplus, as indicated by the deadweight loss shaded with diagonal lines on the graph. So that's what we were saying before. The decrease in consumer surplus is so big that the increase in producer surplus and the government's revenue is not enough to offset that decrease. Hence why there's those two little deadweight loss sections. So therefore, when there is a tariff, the market is not allocatively efficient because total surpluses are not maximised and there is a net welfare loss. Net welfare loss means that if you were to add up all the parties individually, as a whole, producers, consumers, government, they are worse off as indicated by the deadweight loss. So there is some potential that could have been earned but isn't. Alright, and so that's the whole answer to question 2. Let's have a look at the marking schedule to compare our answer and see what you need to do to get the grade that you want. So for part A, it says that to get achieved, it's okay to make a couple of mistakes. So there were 6 things that you had to do, and if you only did 4 of them, then you get achieved, and if you do all 6, then you get merit. So that was labelling the correct QSQD, correct consumer surplus, correct producer surplus, correct tariff revenue, and then correct deadweight loss. So we did all that, so that's good. So for question B, to get achieved, for the consumer's part, you have to say that a tariff will decrease consumer surplus due to consumers paying a higher price or purchasing a lower quantity. So you have to say what will happen, so consumer surplus decreases, and then give one of the reasons, so price or quantity changing. And you can see that that's the same for all of the situations. So tariff will increase PS, producer surplus, due to them receiving a higher price or selling a large quantity. The tariff will result in a loss of allocative efficiency as it creates a deadweight loss, or total surpluses are not maximised, and then the government gains tariff revenue. So basically, to get achieved, you just have to say the right thing. Is there an increase or is there a decrease? And give one reason. To get merit, you need to add in a bit more detail. So for consumers who pay a tariff, it will decrease their consumer surplus due to consumers paying a higher price. So the difference between the price that they are willing to pay and what they actually pay decreases. Or you could say that due to purchasing a lower quantity, there are fewer units from which to gain a surplus. So what's going on here is that you still only have to say either price or quantity changing, but then you also have to add in that part about the difference between what they're willing to pay and actually pay and the fewer units. This is interesting because often that sentence will be in the excellence section, but they've done it here in the merit section. So it's really important that you remember that sentence. For producers, for merit, you would say that New Zealand producers of textile and clothing will benefit from the increased producer surplus due to the higher price received, so the difference between the price that they're willing to accept and the price they actually receive increases, or due to them selling a higher quantity, so there are more units from which to gain a surplus. And then you've got to talk about the difference between the New Zealand producers who make the clothes and then the ones who import it. So the tariff is more beneficial for the producers of New Zealand-made textiles and clothing with a valid reason. And then to get excellence, that valid reason needs to be that they benefit more because of the improved competitiveness or market share or have an option to lower prices. So that's what we were saying there, where New Zealand-made producers get to receive a higher price, whereas New Zealand importers have to pay that higher price. And then for the government, you just have to say that the government gains the tariff revenue and they can use that to fund other sectors of the economy. So you see here what I was saying before, they like it when you give some examples. So here they've given the example of healthcare. And then lastly, for allocative efficiency, you say a tariff will result in a loss of allocative efficiency because it creates a deadweight loss. Because the loss of consumer surplus is not fully offset by the gain in producer surplus and tariff revenue for the government, and the sum of consumer and producer surpluses are not maximised. And then it's the same thing for excellence, you just have to make sure that you refer to graph 3 and the resource material. So what that means is, for referring to the graph, you say the changes, so like Q1 to QS, for example. And then referring to the resource material means that you actually talk about the item that it's talking about. So you're talking about textiles and clothing here, and we've done all of that up to an excellence level. Okay, so we'll leave it there for this part 2 of the exam. Shortly we'll be releasing part 3, where we cover that last section of this paper. And that question is all about subsidies. If you're doing the 3.1 external or any other NCEA Economics, you might want to check out our channel. Check out our playlist specifically for the 3.1 exam, where we cover every graph in depth and how to word your answers for the exam. Drop a comment down below if you have any questions about what we've covered today. Also, we're always taking suggestions about videos you'd like us to cover next, so drop a comment down below. Also, we would really appreciate it if you liked this video and subscribe. It just really helps the algorithm so that we can keep on making free videos. As always, see you next time for more big brain energy.